In the forgotten corners of medieval Europe, there were whispers of shadows that crept into graveyards at dusk, not to rob the dead, but to feast on them. They weren't ghouls. They weren't beasts. They were men, men of faith, driven by guilt, terror, and the unrelenting fear of hell. These self-ordained penitents performed the unthinkable. They opened graves, pulled the rotting flesh from corpses, and swallowed it, believing that with every bite, they were absorbing the sins of the dead and transferring them into their own tormented souls. They were called sin-eaters. But in the darkest reaches of France and Germany, a far more extreme sect emerged, ones who didn't just perform rituals, they embraced damnation as devotion. They believed salvation came not from purity, but from decay. They smeared ashes of the burned dead onto their tongues. They chewed bone. They swallowed rot. They welcomed disease as a form of divine punishment. And they believed the more they suffered, the more souls they could rescue. Churches tried to silence them. Monarchs hunted them. But the cult of the ash-eaters spread like plague. And what they left behind was far more horrifying than the corpses they consumed. It began in silence. A crumbling chapel, buried in the foothills of the Vosges Mountains, long forgotten by maps and men alike. It hadn't held mass in over 300 years. Ivy choked the stonework, moss grew thick across the altar, and the wind howled through broken stained glass like a ghost begging for forgiveness. The excavation team wasn't there for holiness. They were looking for medieval tomb markers, burial records, bones, maybe even relics of minor saints. But what they found was a grave that shouldn't exist. Hidden beneath the altar itself, beneath the place where bread became body and wine became blood, was a small pit filled not with a single coffin, but with dozens of human remains. Limbs jumbled, skulls shattered, jawbones pried open. But what horrified the team wasn't just the bodies, it was what was done to them. Bones showed teeth marks. Flesh had been sliced away, not with care, but with hunger. And on the stone floor around the pit were symbols burned in soot, circles of ash, drawn in meticulous patterns, filled with human teeth. The church's records made no mention of this crypt. In fact, no records mentioned the chapel at all. That's when they found the scroll, hidden in a wall cavity behind the altar, wrapped in waxed cloth, bound in human hair. Inside, it described something no priest had ever taught, and no pope had ever allowed. A sect of penitents who believed that salvation required consuming the sins of the dead through their corpses. They called themselves les mange cendres, the ash-eaters. The scroll wasn't written in ecclesiastical Latin. It was raw, almost panicked, written like a confession, like a last warning. We devour that others may rise. We burn that others may ascend. Through rot, we are cleansed. Through ash, we are reborn. At first, it sounded like the ravings of a mad monk, until the scroll began naming names, and dates, and locations. All across medieval France and Germany, remote chapels like this had been built in secret by rogue orders who had taken the sin-eating tradition far beyond folklore. They didn't just consume food placed on corpses. They consumed the corpses themselves. The ash-eaters believed that the flesh of the dead was saturated with sin, and that only by devouring that corruption could the soul be freed from hell. But unlike earlier sin-eaters, these cultists didn't perform small rites. They enacted sacrifices, self-inflicted diseases, starvation, ritual scarring, and they buried themselves alive, in graves beside the ones they desecrated. As the investigators continued digging beneath the chapel floor, they found a smaller tunnel, caved in, collapsed long ago. But just before it ended, buried in silt, they uncovered a single object that defied reason, a chalice, made of bone, and sealed with dried blood. Inside, a black, tar-like residue later confirmed to be human fat, mixed with ash and sacramental wine. Someone had drunk from this. Repeatedly. This wasn't just sin-eating. This was transformation. A belief system based on the consumption of punishment itself. The ash-eaters believed that to truly free the damned, they had to become damned in their place. It wasn't just faith. It was a sickness sanctified. And as we dig deeper into history, we'll discover how these monstrous rituals began, not in horror, but in desperation. When death swept across Europe, and the line between salvation and madness vanished. Long before the ash-eaters carved symbols into bone and drank blood-thick wine, there were whispers of a much older practice. primitive, pagan, and disturbingly widespread. It began not with rot, but with ritual. In the mist-drenched hills of pre-Christian Britain, among the Celts and the early Welsh, the dead were never sent to the grave alone. They were accompanied by bread, beer, salt, coins, and sometimes a man, a living man. He wasn't a priest. He was an outcast, a figure wrapped in rags, paid in copper or bread to perform a single horrifying rite, to sit beside the corpse, place food and drink upon the chest of the deceased, and then consume it, slowly, solemnly, in silence. It was believed that this act transferred the dead's unconfessed sins into the body of the eater. He was, quite literally, a vessel of damnation, a human sponge for moral decay. He was the sin eater, feared, shunned, necessary. Because in a world where salvation required purity and purgatory waited for every soul left tainted, families would pay any price to ease the journey of their loved ones, even if it meant damning a stranger. This wasn't just folklore. It appears in Christian texts, too, though always in whispers, always in the margins. The church condemned the practice, yet tolerated it. Why? Because it worked. Or at least, people believed it did. And belief, in the medieval world, was everything. Sin-eating became a strange, forbidden bridge between worlds, one foot in ancient animism, the other in rising Christianity. The act persisted across the British Isles, the Alps, and eventually across the Rhineland. But something changed in the 14th century. A wave of death swept across Europe so fast, so brutally, that no priest could keep up. The Black Death didn't just kill the body. It killed hope. When entire families died unconfessed, unshriven, and unburied, communities turned to anyone who offered absolution, no matter how grotesque. And that's when the sin-eaters changed. They were no longer just beggars paid for ritual. They became devoted volunteers, men and women so terrified of damnation, not for themselves, but for others, that they gave their lives to consume the sins of entire villages. In plague-ridden France, makeshift orders formed, small, secretive bands of zealots who believed they could rescue souls not just symbolically, but literally. They developed their own theologies, built on fragments of scripture, mysticism, and fever dreams. They stopped using bread. They began using flesh. The logic was simple, if deranged. If sins could cling to a body after death, and if sin-eating drew those sins into the eater, then what if the eater took on the full weight of that sin, not just symbolically, but physically? What if they ate the body itself? And what if the more they suffered from the act, the more souls they could redeem? Thus began the evolution from sin-eater to ash-eater, a new breed of holy martyr, one who welcomed disease, decay, and torment as proof of their spiritual strength. Unlike their Celtic predecessors, they didn't hide in shame. They saw their affliction as sacred, a divine burden. They scoured plague pits. They collected burned remains from execution pyres. They smeared themselves with ash from cremated heretics. And they kept records, ledgers, scrolls, and diaries, many of which were uncovered centuries later in isolated monastic ruins. They were proud of what they did, because they believed they were buying salvation for the dead, with their own flesh. The earliest known reference to an ash-eater by name comes from a 1351 parchment found in the ruins of a Pyrenean hermitage. It reads, "Brother Matthew consumed 3 of the newly dead. He wept as he swallowed, for the sin was bitter. But he endured. By suffering, he climbed closer to the Lamb." The transformation was complete. Sin-eaters had always walked the line between folklore and fear. But the ash-eaters? They embraced fear. They built theology out of suffering. And in doing so, they became the stuff of whispered legend and ecclesiastical terror. Next, we descend into the darkest chapter of their birth, the Black Death, and the cult that rose in its ashes. The year was 1348. The streets of Marseille choked with corpses. Smoke rose endlessly from pyres too small for the dead. Priests collapsed mid-sermon. Children died in the arms of already dead mothers. Cities became graveyards. Villages vanished overnight. Across Europe, the Black Death tore through flesh and faith alike, killing nearly 1 out of every 2 people. But worse than the death was the uncertainty. No one knew what caused it. No one knew who would be next. And worst of all, no one knew where the souls of the unshriven dead would go. Mass graves overflowed. Confessions were forgotten. Funeral rites skipped, sacraments denied. To a medieval mind, this wasn't just a public health disaster. It was spiritual annihilation. If sin led to damnation, and millions were dying unconfessed, then hell wasn't just filling, it was bursting. And into this theological panic stepped the Ash Eaters. They weren't yet called that. Not officially, not out loud. But in the chaos of plague, something dark and deliberate began to form in the margins. It started in the Vosges region of France, a place where mysticism had always simmered just beneath the surface, where old Celtic rites lingered under Christian robes, where the bones of saints were venerated just a few hills away from druidic stone circles. In a small monastic outpost outside Epinal, a monk named Brother Arnaud recorded a visitation in his personal journal. A man came to us in sackcloth, pale as bone, with scabs upon his eyes. He asked for no shelter, only permission to crawl among the plague dead. He said, "I will eat what they cannot take with them." We believed him mad, but he kissed the mouth of a corpse and wept as he swallowed. That man's name was never recorded, but his act, his creed, spread like rot through the monasteries. Soon, others began copying the ritual, not out of madness, out of purpose. They formed a loose brotherhood, not sanctioned by Rome, not recognized by any abbey. They called themselves Les Penitents de la Cendre, the penitents of the ash. They believed that God had withdrawn his hand from the world, and that only those willing to bear the full weight of humanity's rot could restore divine balance. So they made themselves into offerings. They would fast until near death. They would open the stomachs of plague victims and smear the contents across their own bodies. They would inhale the fumes of charred corpses, believing the ash carried pieces of the soul. And when they could not find dead to consume, they would mutilate themselves, chewing their own fingers, drinking their own blood, offering it up in place of another's sin. They didn't fear the plague. They invited it. And the terrifying thing? They were immune. Or at least, they appeared to be. Reports from Strasbourg and Colmar noted that these ash-covered figures walked freely among the dead, slept in corpse pits, and drank from contaminated wells, yet survived. Local peasants began calling them Les Saints Pourris, the rotted saints. They became revered, feared, copied. In rural hamlets where no priest remained, villagers would seek out these grotesque figures to perform rites over their dead. Instead of holy water, they sprinkled ash. Instead of prayers, they howled lamentations. Instead of wine, they drank marrow. The church was horrified. By 1352, papal emissaries were dispatched to investigate rumors of cannibalistic cults forming in plague zones. What they found were not satanic rites, but deeply religious ones twisted by desperation. One inquisitor wrote, "They speak of love and eat the dead. They speak of salvation and carry rot in their bellies. Yet I have seen their eyes, clearer than any priest's. Either they are damned, or they are wholly beyond our understanding." But by then, it was too late. The cult had already spread beyond France, into Bavaria, into the Black Forest, into the Swiss Alps. Everywhere the plague went, they followed, like carrion crows with rosaries. And everywhere they went, they left behind signs, ash circles in graveyards, teeth missing from skulls, chalices of bone, burned icons with human fat smeared in cruciform. But the most disturbing find? A parchment unearthed in a monastery ruin in Metz. It contained a liturgy, a full-blown theological doctrine, titled Sacramentum Putredinis, the Sacrament of Rot. It detailed 7 stages of sanctification through bodily decay, 7 rituals, 7 forms of suffering, 7 ways to consume the sin of another and inherit their pain. The Black Death didn't just break bodies. It broke boundaries. And in the ashes of that destruction, the Ash Eaters rose, not as monsters, but as martyrs. What began as silent desperation was fast becoming an organized religion. And next, we enter their sanctuaries, their temples of suffering, their rituals of filth and fire. They met in silence, not in grand cathedrals, but in damp crypts, overgrown ruins, abandoned ossuaries, and plague pits long sealed from the living. The Ash Eaters had no official churches, no bells to summon the faithful. Their sanctuaries were built from rot, bone-lined tunnels, burnt chapels, and tombs hollowed out from the inside. Their rites were not spoken in Latin, but chanted in whispers, using a patched-together liturgy, part scripture, part madness. But every ritual began the same way, with ash. The ashes were sacred, collected from the burned remains of the unburied dead, particularly those who had died suddenly, violently, or damned. It wasn't symbolic. These ashes were not sprinkled like holy water. They were consumed, mixed with sacramental wine, or when wine was not available, with urine, and swallowed during what they called the Feast of Burden. The first stage of their ritual was purification through filth. Participants stripped naked, covered their bodies in plague-soaked linens, and crawled through pits of decomposing flesh. Some even sought out the freshly dead to lie beside, believing the soul's heat still lingered in the corpse and could be transferred by contact. Then came the scourging of the spirit, a ritualistic self-flagellation performed not with whips, but with the rib bones of plague victims, sharpened into points. They would tear into their backs, chant the names of the dead, and offer each wound as a gateway for sins to enter. They weren't expelling sin. They were inviting it. To be an ash eater meant becoming a vessel, a poison chalice. Their most sacred rite was called the inversion, a mock mass. The altar, a corpse. The bread, skin, sliced from the chest of the deceased. The wine, blood, often days old, mixed with ash and bile. A chosen penitent would kneel before the body and whisper, "Let me take what you could not leave behind." Then, in front of the silent assembly, they would chew and swallow. Not in haste, not with revulsion, but with reverence. In their theology, sin was not an infection, it was a currency, a burden that could be transferred, traded, even hoarded. The more suffering they endured, the more sins they could carry. The more sins they carried, the more souls they could redeem. And suffering was the holiest of sacraments. That's why many ash eaters infected themselves deliberately. Boils were blessings. Fever was purification. One chronicled penitent, Brother Gerhard of Alsace, even documented drinking the pus of plague sores, writing, "I have swallowed death, and in doing so, denied it power. My pain is his mirror." But not all their rituals ended in private ecstasy. Some culminated in public agony. During what was known as the Feast of Despair, the eldest members would volunteer to be burned alive, willingly. But not quickly. They weren't martyred on pyres. Instead, they were wrapped in oil-soaked shrouds and slowly set alight, limb by limb, over hours. Their screams were not mourned. They were sung along with. Because to die in agony was to absorb the sins of thousands. Their charred remains were then ground into ash and distributed to other members, either to be ingested or buried beneath altars as holy relics. To outsiders, it was barbarism. To the ash eaters, it was grace, a theology of pain, fire, and rot. One disturbing manuscript, the Testament of the Ash Priest, describes an advanced ritual involving the crucible chalice, in which three forms of the dead, flesh, bone, and ash, were combined into a thick slurry and passed among the inner circle for consumption. It ends with the chilling line, "In becoming tombs, we become doors. In swallowing death, we vomit life." These weren't isolated acts of madness. They were codified, repeated, celebrated, and as word of these rituals spread, rumors took hold. Whispers of men glowing from sickness, yet never dying. Of black-veiled women speaking in tongues after eating the eyes of the dead. Of villages spared from plague after a single, ash-covered figure walked through, chanting the names of the damned. To many, they were monsters. To some, saints. But to each other, they were something else entirely, saviors. And next, we find the place where their salvation turned most grotesque. A monastery in the mountains. A ledger of names written in blood. And monks who didn't fear death. They devoured it. High in the wooded silence of the Vosges Mountains, obscured by mist and snowfall for most of the year, there once stood a monastery with no name. Locals called it Le Reclusoir, the shut-in place. A broken stone path wound up through twisted pines to its gates, which bore no cross. Only a crude carving of an open mouth, gaping wide, lined with what looked like teeth. It was abandoned when the church finally arrived. But not empty. Inside, investigators discovered a chapel stripped of its pews, its altar blackened by soot, its crucifix inverted and scorched. Beneath the sanctuary was a labyrinth of tunnels, hand-dug and narrow, stretching deep into the rock. The air reeked of rot, mildew, and something worse, the unmistakable stench of long-decayed flesh. They found bones, not buried, sorted, skulls placed in rows, femurs stacked like firewood, jawbones pried open and arranged in circles, symbols drawn on the stone in dried blood and smeared ash. And at the very heart of this crypt, they uncovered a sealed chamber. Inside, a ledger. It was wrapped in human skin. The cover was stitched with hair. The ink, later confirmed by forensic historians, was made from oxidized blood and charcoal. Its title was etched in Latin, Liber Devorationis, the Book of Devouring. Page after page, it listed names, not just of the dead, but of the monks who ate them. Dates, locations, rituals performed, sins absorbed. Each monk signed his own entry with a symbol, never a name. Many of them were simple: a blackened sun, a dripping cross, a broken chalice. Others were more disturbing: mouths full of thorns, eyes gouged by daggers, stomachs bloated and split open. These were the blood monks, an elite order within the ash-eaters. Not only did they consume the dead, they sought out the worst of them: murderers, heretics, excommunicates, the violently damned. They believed that the deeper the sin, the greater the salvation when consumed. Their bodies were testaments to their belief. The remains found in the chamber told the rest of the story. Nearly 20 monks, their bones deformed by malnutrition and disease. Skulls trepanned, drilled with crude holes, possibly to let the spirits escape. Rib cages broken inward, as though crushed by ecstatic violence. One had written on his own femur with soot, "I drank the thief. I burned with the heretic. I wrought for them, and I rise." They weren't killing for food. They were dying for it. Among the ruins, a stone basin was found, what they called a font of burden. In it were human teeth, pieces of scorched tongue, and hardened resin mixed with bone dust. This concoction, according to the ledger, was mixed with monk's blood and taken during the sacrament of descent, a rite meant to mirror Christ's descent into hell. But unlike Christ, the blood monks believed they must stay in hell, spiritually, until the souls they bore were freed. In one of the final entries, a monk who signed only as the Ash Brother wrote, "There is no heaven for me. I am the worm. I am the tomb. The flame eats me that another may walk in light." They saw themselves as spiritual sewage systems, draining the worst filth from humanity into their own bodies so that others could ascend clean. They fasted for weeks, then gorged on rot. They prayed on beds of bone. They stitched their lips shut in penance, only to cut them open again during ritual feeding. But the most disturbing detail was what they did with the leftovers. According to the ledger, nothing from a consumed corpse was discarded. Any parts not eaten, hair, nails, fluid, were dried and pressed into tablets, which were then buried beneath the monastery floor in what they called the Garden of Sorrow. It was believed that when Judgment Day arrived, these remains would rise, not as damned souls, but as purified beings, freed by the pain of their devourers. In essence, the monks traded their humanity for spiritual plumbing. When Rome finally caught wind of Le Reclusoir, it sent a team of inquisitors and soldiers. What they found was not resistance, but mass death. Nearly all the monks had already starved themselves to death or succumbed to infection. Yet their faith lingered, on the walls, in the bones, in the ledger. But one room was left untouched, a sealed vault behind the apse. Inside, a single monk, mummified by the cold, kneeling, mouth agape, hands clutching a chalice made of fused skull fragments. His stomach cavity had been sliced open. Empty. He had eaten, until there was nothing left to take in. They called him the last blood monk. Next, we follow the rot that spread from these mountain vaults into the very heart of Christian Europe, where even communion was not safe. It was a quiet Sunday morning in the town of Worms, Germany, in the winter of 1379. Snow dusted the rooftops. Church bells rang through the bitter air. The faithful gathered, as they always had, for the Eucharist, that most sacred of sacraments, the communion of bread and wine transformed into the body and blood of Christ. But what they received that day wasn't bread. It began with a whisper. A woman kneeling at the altar bit into the wafer and recoiled. Not from blasphemy, from pain. Her gums were bleeding. A child began to choke on his host, coughing up something small and sharp. A priest cut open a consecrated loaf and found something grayish, irregular, and hard. Bone. Tiny fragments of human bone, shaved thin, baked into the dough, undetectable until bitten. The church launched an immediate investigation, expecting to find a lunatic baker, a corrupt priest, perhaps a sect of Satanists. But what they uncovered was far worse, a secret brotherhood operating within the clergy itself. They called themselves the Devoted of the Husk, a splinter group of the Ash Eaters who believed that the only path to universal salvation was through mass involuntary sin consumption. In other words, they would trick the innocent into partaking in holy rituals that absorbed the sins of the dead without their knowledge. It was communion by coercion. Their logic? The more souls who bore the burden of the damned, even unknowingly, the more the weight would be dispersed. If all were tainted, then none could be truly condemned. They weren't cannibals for themselves anymore. They were cannibals for everyone. In a dusty cellar beneath the Cathedral of Trier, authorities discovered a hidden chamber lined with jars, each one filled with ash labeled by name, date of death, and cause. Most were plague victims. Others were far worse. Heretics, execution victims, excommunicated monks. Mixed into this ash was a powdery gray substance the devoted called pergamentum, a blend of pulverized teeth, dried bile, and pulverized cartilage. It was this mixture that had been added, in trace amounts, to communion flour. It had happened not once, but for years. This wasn't the work of a rogue priest. It was systemic. Entire congregations had unwittingly consumed the dead. One of the unearthed ledgers detailed a chilling formula. For every 33 souls fed thus, may first be lifted from the pit. Through the shared tongue, damnation is diluted. The math was medieval, but the belief was sincere. And more disturbing still, it worked in reverse too. The Ash Eaters believed that if a living sinner could consume the flesh of the holy, the righteous soul would rise faster, and their own sin might be lessened. So they sought out the bones of saints. Grave robbing was nothing new in medieval Europe. But this was not about relics for display. This was theft for consumption. One stolen rib from Saint Odilia's shrine in Alsace was found boiled in wine and served to a circle of penitents in what was described as a meal of luminous agony. Each participant recorded dreams of burning towers and weeping angels that night. They believed they had tasted the edge of heaven. Church response was swift and brutal. Over 30 priests, monks, and laity were tortured, executed, or excommunicated across 3 dioceses. But the deeper the church dug, the more entrenched the infection appeared. Some bishops themselves had quietly authorized sanctified sin dilution. Not out of malice. Out of despair. The plague had left theological wreckage. Rome could not absorb it all. Whispers circulated that even some papal advisors in Avignon had entertained the idea of redistributive absolution in secret conclaves, fearing that traditional salvation was mathematically impossible in a world with so many dead and so few clean souls. What began as a cult had become a contagion of belief, and at the center of it all were the bones. Stolen, ground, baked, fed to thousands without their knowledge. The bread of life had become the flesh of rot. The wine of salvation had become blood leached from plague-ridden veins. And through it all, the Ash Eaters thrived. Because even as they were hunted, burned, and exiled, they were winning. They had made the church complicit. But the next revelation would be too much even for those willing to look away. In a crumbling convent wall, behind a sealed bricked passage, was a body, one that should never have been there. And beside it, a diary, one that would change everything. They were repairing the cloister walls of the ruined convent of St. Euphrosyne in 1423 when the bricks cracked open, not from decay, but from something pushing outward. Behind the collapse was a narrow recess, sealed from the inside. Inside it, a body, not a skeleton, a mummified corpse, remarkably preserved by the cold and the stone. Kneeling upright, head bowed, arms folded tightly to her chest, almost in prayer. It was a woman, clad in the tattered remains of a nun's habit, lips stitched shut with strands of blackened twine, hands clasped around a leather-bound book, swollen with age and rot. She had not been buried. She had sealed herself in. The nuns of St. Euphrosyne had all died during the second plague wave in the 1360s. The convent had long been abandoned, the dead scattered. But this woman had not perished with them. She had chosen to stay. The book she clutched would become known as the Confession of Sister Seraphine. It took weeks to decipher. Its pages were brittle, its ink smudged with what appeared to be blood and bile. But what it revealed would send shockwaves through the church's private archives, most of which were buried again under Vatican seal. Sister Seraphine had been the last surviving member of the convent. When plague struck, the priests fled. The gates were sealed. The sisters starved. But then, according to her account, a visitor came. He was wrapped in sackcloth, eyes black as soot. He bore no name, only a chalice. She called him the Ash Priest. He told her the sins of the dead could still be saved, that if she had the courage to eat for them, to suffer for them, she could rescue every soul trapped within the cloister walls. And so, in madness or in revelation, she agreed. What followed was a descent into sacred horror. Each day, Sister Seraphine exhumed the bodies of her fallen sisters, those she had lived beside, prayed beside, suffered beside. She took parts from each, the eyes of the Mother Superior, to see what she saw, the tongue of the choir mistress, to silence her bitter gossip, the liver of the novice who had self-flagellated until death, to absorb her torment. She dried the flesh in the convent's bread oven, ground bones into flour, mixed the remains with wine hoarded from the sacristy. She created her own Eucharist. For weeks, she conducted daily masses, writing out liturgies in her journal. She took each sin into herself, recording fevered visions. I see a hall of black mirrors. Each reflects a face I have eaten. They smile without mouths. My womb burns with the sins of lust. My lungs choke with the pride of the choir. But then, something changed. Seraphine began to believe the sins weren't just being taken in. They were staying. Her entries darken. They whisper in my sleep. They gnaw at my insides. I vomit blood and dream of serpents with faces I know. And finally, if I leave this place, they will spill out of me and into the world. I must seal myself. I must become a tomb. Her final act was to brick herself into the wall, alive, with only her book, her guilt, and the promise that she would carry the weight of her convent's sins into death. But there was one last horror. As investigators examined the corpse, they discovered something under the skin, specifically beneath the flesh of her abdomen, an incision crudely stitched. Inside her stomach, preserved by bile and the cold, an infant's femur. The implications were never officially recorded, but her journal offered a final, cryptic line. The mother bore the sin. The child must carry it too. No birth records exist. No mention of pregnancy. Only that sentence. And the bone. The church officially ruled Sister Seraphine a victim of madness. A tragic casualty of plague-induced hysteria. But within underground ash-eater communities, she became something else entirely, a saint. Shrines bearing her image began appearing across the Rhineland. Black-robed women knelt before candles, whispering her name. And in some ceremonies, a single bone, often a child's, was placed upon the altar. To them, she was the mother of burden, a martyr who gave birth not to life, but to sin incarnate. And she was only one of many. Because as we'll soon see, by the 15th century, the church had lost control. Ash-eaters were no longer hiding. They were preaching, recruiting, spreading, and Rome was preparing to kill them all. By the mid-1400s, whispers had turned to roars. No longer confined to plague pits or crumbling monasteries, the ash-eaters were everywhere, in marketplaces, forests, alleys behind cathedrals. Their theology, once born in darkness and disease, had mutated into a movement. They began calling themselves the Carriers. And their message was simple. We suffer, so you don't have to. It was not heresy whispered in shadows anymore. It was preached aloud, in open defiance of the church. These new ash-eaters wore black robes smeared with soot, bone pendants hanging from their necks. Some carved teeth into their skin. Others wore masks fashioned from dried human faces, stitched at the lips, as symbols of silence and suffering. In Basel, a known carrier was seen climbing the church steps on his knees, bleeding from wounds he had reopened with shards of glass, chanting, "Let me drink your sins. Let me rot in your name." People didn't stop him. They joined him. Poor farmers, grieving mothers, war veterans, lepers, all drawn to the promise of salvation through shared rot. The movement surged in the territories broken by war and plague, the places Rome had neglected or lost. And the church finally noticed. Pope Eugene IV declared the movement an abomination against God and creation. An emergency inquisitorial decree, known as De Fames Corruptoris, the Eaters of Rot, was issued in 1436, authorizing immediate investigation, torture, and execution of any suspected participants. Inquisitors were deployed across the German states, Burgundy, and the Alpine passes. What they found horrified even them. Hidden shrines of bone and ash beneath village wells. Children branded with blackened crosses on their chests. Books written in blood, some still warm. In one infamous trial in Regensburg, 17 villagers were convicted of consuming a stew made from the thigh of a dead woman who had confessed to adultery. Their feast, they claimed, was her penance and their atonement. Each villager was burned alive in the town square. But the executions did nothing. If anything, they made things worse. Ash-eater theology embraced martyrdom. Every death was seen as a final absorption of the world's sin. The flames weren't punishment, they were transfiguration. One carrier, burned at the stake in Zurich, screamed through the fire, "Let me burn so they may rise. Let me blister for your light." His followers collected his ashes after the execution and ate them. And still, the cult of all, 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 the cult of all. They replaced relics in cathedrals with bones of sinners. They infiltrated processions dressed as flagellants, bleeding openly, carrying jars of plague ash. The Inquisition responded with a level of brutality not seen since the Albigensian Crusade. Hundreds were tortured, dozens of towns purged, entire monasteries burned on the suspicion of harboring eaters. And yet, the cult remained. Why? Because the rot was ideological. Not all eaters consumed flesh. Some simply believed. A faith of filth, a theology of torment, and a doctrine that, terrifyingly, made sense in a world where the righteous died screaming and the wicked died rich. Even some inquisitors, in their secret journals, questioned what they had witnessed. One wrote, "They suffer more than any saint. Their pain is chosen, their purpose unshakable. If they are damned, then they are the most holy of the damned." As executions soared, the cult turned inward. They stopped recruiting. They started preparing. Records begin to mention something ominous: the final supper, a prophesied ritual, a last act of burden, a consumption so total, so complete, that it would redeem all souls in one terrible, glorious event. And at its center would be the Ash Priest, the same name that had appeared in Seraphine's journal, the same title spoken by heretics across 3 countries. Was he real? A spirit? A title passed from one devourer to the next? No one knew. But in 1471, an abandoned abbey near Lake Constance was found scorched to its foundations. Inside the ruins, carved into blackened stone, "He has eaten. The world will weep. The end begins." Next, we witnessed that end, a ritual so horrifying that even the ash-eaters called it their Last Supper. The abbey was built to be silent. Tucked into the cliffs above Lake Constance, it had once housed a monastic order so austere, they refused to speak the name of God aloud. But by the late 1400s, it had fallen into ruin, abandoned after its last abbot died of plague, surrounded by his starved monks. Then, without announcement, it was reborn. Locals whispered of smoke curling from the chimneys again, of hooded men seen at night, hauling carts of bones, of chanting that echoed through the pines, not Latin, but something older. Crooked syllables, wet consonants, words that made dogs howl. No one went near it, until it was too late. In the winter of 1472, a traveler, starving and frostbitten, stumbled into the nearest village, babbling about a mass of flesh. He claimed to have escaped a holy banquet at the abbey, where a dozen robed figures circled a pit of fire and devoured a corpse as it screamed. He said there were others, bound, bleeding, alive. His hands were blistered with burns. His teeth were filed down. He died 2 days later, not from the cold, but from intestinal failure. His stomach was full of unprocessed human fat and burned hair. When a group of Franciscan brothers attempted to investigate, they found the abbey gates sealed with melted wax, blood, and human molars. Above the door, burned into the wood, "This is the supper that ends the world." What they found inside would go down as one of the most grotesque religious discoveries in European history. The entire chapel, once a place of solemn prayer, had been transformed into a dining hall of the damned. A single long table, made of gravestones, stretched the nave. On it were severed limbs, some charred, others raw. Bowls of coagulated blood, mixed with herbs. Veins, tied into knots. Skulls with candles burning inside. And at the head of the table sat a throne of bones. Its occupant was still there. A man, unmoving, wrapped in robes so thick with ash and tallow they cracked like pottery. His face was hidden beneath a mask made of fused jawbones. His chest had been cut open, not vertically, but peeled outward, ribs cracked and spread. His heart cavity was empty, yet around his throne, a circle of 12 bodies knelt. Their tongues had been cut out. Each had a hole in their stomach, surgically opened, packed with rosary beads, ash, and teeth. This was the final supper. According to documents found beneath the altar, written in charcoal and blood on stretched skin, the ritual was meant to be the consummation of every sin consumed by the order since its birth, a symbolic and literal devouring of the world's rot. The ash priest had supposedly ingested the soul of every sinner who had ever been devoured by the cult, and now he would offer himself as a final atonement. His body, once saturated with 1,000,000 sins, would be burned so that the world might be purged. The ritual ended in fire. The ceiling had collapsed from flame. The windows were blackened. Charred bone fragments were found fused with the stone floor. But one thing survived, the ash chalice, still intact, still resting on the altar. Inside it, a viscous black residue, boiling, even though the room was freezing. Modern chemical analysis found traces of arsenic, lead, mercury, myrrh, opium, and hemoglobin, all blended with sacramental wine. Whoever drank from it would not be healed. They would not be cleansed. They would be annihilated. And that, it seemed, was the point. To die so completely, so grotesquely, that every evil absorbed would be obliterated with them. The Vatican never publicly acknowledged the event, but secret files from 17th century inquisitors reference the banquet of fire and the final consumption of a black priest in the Alps. One cardinal called it the heresy that believed God lived in decay. And yet, across Europe, even after the abbey burned, reports of ash-eater cells continued, some in France, others in the Carpathians, even one in 18th century London. One letter from a Jesuit missionary in 1709 warns, "They drink from the bone cup still, and they do not hide." The Last Supper of the Damned may have ended one chapter, but it didn't end the belief. Because belief, once soaked in blood, never dies clean. Centuries have passed since the last recorded rituals at the Lake Constance Abbey. Yet the shadows of the ash-eaters stretch long, staining the pages of history, folklore, and fear. They became ghosts, whispered about in dark corners of Europe. Figures cloaked in ash, appearing at the edges of funerals, hospitals, and battlefields. Some say they evolved beyond flesh, their presence a cursed echo of plague and despair. In the 16th century, the rise of scientific thought and the Reformation fractured the Church's hold on souls. Yet the ash-eaters adapted, sometimes merging with secret societies, sometimes fading into the underworld of occultism and witchcraft. Records mention ash-covered figures during the 30 Years' War, walking through battlefields, silently tending to the dying, or sometimes hastening their deaths. In the 18th and 19th centuries, tales of the Ash Walker surfaced in rural France and Eastern Europe, an eerie figure who appeared at funerals, sometimes seen eating from open graves, always vanishing before dawn. Modern historians debate the reality behind the legends. Were they survivors of medieval fanaticism, or an enduring metaphor for humanity's hunger to purify through pain? One chilling fact remains. Ash-eater rituals always concluded with consumption, not just of flesh or ash, but of guilt itself. They believed that by ingesting the sins of others, they could carry the world's darkness within themselves, an unbearable burden that no normal soul could survive. Some among them did not survive. Some chose not to. And others? They disappeared into the shadows, becoming myth, nightmare, and perhaps something darker. As the world modernized, the ash-eaters slipped underground, hiding in the crevices of forgotten history. But their hunger, their belief in redemption through rot, still lingers in cults that claim descent from them. Groups who perform grotesque rituals in secret, convinced they can save humanity through self-inflicted decay. Some modern practitioners have been arrested for acts of cannibalism, self-mutilation, and sacramental desecration, all echoing centuries-old ash-eater practices. The final question remains: what if the ash-eaters were right? What if sin is a burden that must be shared, carried by the willing, swallowed whole? What if salvation requires us to confront the rot within, literally, and offer ourselves as tombs for the dead? It's a terrifying thought, because it means that sometimes, to save the living, someone must become the dead. The ash-eaters chose to become that bridge between life and decay, hope and horror. And their story, buried in ash and blood, still haunts the margins of history. If you found this journey into the darkest corners of faith and flesh gripping, subscribe for more explorations of history's forbidden truths. Leave a comment. Would you be willing to bear such a burden? Or would you let the world rot alone? Watch next: the cults that ate their way to salvation, a story of desperation, devotion, and decay. Remember, some sins cannot be buried, only consumed.